talk.
Why do you have to be late every effing time?
I'm sorry. I know. I'll be right there, I promise. Last week, I was invited to talk in a virtual, obviously, classroom about the biology, the neurobiology of ADHD. And the people in this classroom listening to me were so much cooler than I am because I'm just talking about the science of it. They are actually going to be the people that will do something to help kids and adults with ADHD to get the help they need. And I can tell you, based on that discussion we had afterwards, oh man, they're gonna do such a great job at it. And because I'm a little bit busy at the moment and procrastinating like mad, I'm gonna do the same presentation to you now. ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And let's just agree right now that when I say ADHD, I mean ADHD, and that this includes the inattentive form usually called ADDs. Actually, not an unknown disorder, just massively misunderstood and much more problematic than one imagines. It's not an excuse. They are not trying to annoy you on purpose by not remembering anything, being unconcentrated or hyperactive and too chatty. Come on, as if that's a thing. You usually do not grow out of it, and it's not just being a kid. It's actually a neurological behavior disorder that needs to be taken seriously. Its origin does not lie in the poor upbringing of the parents or the inability of the teachers to keep their pupils in check. It's rather a slightly different, slightly less focusable wiring between the brain synapses. It is not clear to many that there are two, some scientists even speak of 3 forms of ADHD, which only differ in the severity and line of the symptoms. ADD is not a completely different thing. In both or all 3 forms, there are common characteristics of poor concentration, forgetfulness, and inattentiveness. ADD patients are very inattentive, dreamy, slow, and maybe emotionally hypersensitive and sometimes even sensitive to physical touch. They are often called the daydreamers, and in school they are those students who are not attentive, but staring out the window. They don't bother anybody, and that's why they often go undiagnosed for a long time, because you don't really notice that something is wrong. Then there is the H out of the ADHD, who seems to have an excess of energy. They are the children who fidget around permanently in school and thereby disrupt the class. They are class clowns, and the teachers notice very quickly that something is wrong with them simply because they are very stressful for their environment. Attention cannot be held, and the children seem very erratic and over the top, impulsive. I know this actually sounds as if it is all super fun for the children, but it is very stressful because they notice how other people are annoyed by them. Their parents, their teachers, their friends, etc. And they usually try so hard to behave normally, but just can't. And the third form is a combination of the two. In over 70% of cases, these symptoms persist into adulthood. In adults with ADHD, social pressure usually turns the hyperactivity part into inward restlessness, which often leads to other psychological problems such as depression, stress, and anxiety disorders. Imagine having to show up to your job in the morning and never making it on time, or postpone all your tasks until the last second, or being so messy that you and your family suffer from it, and you try to fight it with all your might, but it's not that easy either, because you can't train yourself to new behaviors so easily in that case, and you end up thinking what everyone else thinks as well. I'm too lazy, too stupid, too slow, too annoying, too loud, too emotional. But let's start from scratch. The brain is a rather pink, slimy, relatively solid blob of cells that lets us think, perceive, feel, and do everything we do. We don't have a brain, we are a brain, in a brain-controlled skeleton covered in flesh. Like an Iron Man suit, the body ensures that the brain can do whatever it wants. And that blob is made out of billions of neurons. These are cells that can connect with each other and communicate. There are very many very complicated communication networks of this kind in this brain, and some of them are specialized in very specific tasks. Now, don't get too caught up in that, because the brain can also change in life and adapt after an accident, for example. Go watch the video on brain plasticity afterwards, where I explain how that can happen. But in general, you can say that the prefrontal cortex, for example, is involved in a lot of mechanisms and tasks such as decision-making, personality, motivation, determination, and emotion perception and expression. If it didn't work or wasn't there, we wouldn't have a personality, we couldn't notice other people's emotions or express our own, we couldn't make decisions, and so on. There are other areas in the brain that are responsible for speech or hearing. hearing, for example. As I said, that with the areas is very simplified because most tasks are usually more complicated than that, even if they seem to be very simple to us. Most of the times, many brain areas have to work together. For me to be speaking right now, for example, it takes me thinking of what I want to say, formulating it in my mind in English, which in my case also takes some translating tasks, then using my vocal cords and muscles of my mouth and face to create the sounds that will be exactly what I am saying right now. If I was in a dialogue with someone, that would be even harder because I have to be listening, understanding, and reacting at the same time. And for these complex mechanisms to work, these communication networks must also work together. And here comes the best example that I could come up with while giving that talk I told you about in the beginning, which in my opinion makes it very easy to understand. Each neuron is like a person who has WhatsApp and contacts other WhatsApp users in order to direct the information or commands to where they need to be. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and in our example, basically the app. Every neuron, every user has the app, the dopamine. Not every neuron can get in contact with every other. It's a bit like if I don't have a number, I can't contact that person either. Dopamine, or app, plays a huge role in ADHD. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain that is involved in many tasks such as controlling movement, motivation, and making decisions, etc., etc. So now, if my arms were two completely separate neurons that need to communicate, they would grow closer and closer, and that one would be the message sender, the transmitter of the information, while this one would be the receiver. Normally, when information comes from a neuron, for example, hey, you neuron should make sure that the muscle there moves so that Margarita, I don't know, touches her nose with her tongue. The dopamine is released from the neuron and it binds to the receptors on the second neuron. And this can then process the information and execute or forward it to the responsible cells. In ADHD patients, the dopamine pathways are inhibited so that either less dopamine is released or it cannot bind properly to the receptors of the receiving synapse, for example. So here comes our WhatsApp example once again. If I write a message that contains the information about what time we will have a meeting at work, but this never arrives at my coworker, it may be that I did not send it, that I had no internet, it could not be sent, that the recipient did not have internet, or they simply do not check their WhatsApp regularly to receive the message and the information it contains and act accordingly. Just like that, there are also many reasons and many ways in which dopamine communication pathways in a synapse between the neurons can be faulty. You cannot exactly pinpoint the exact reason why something is faulty because it can be very individually different. But it just means that information in the brain does not arrive there often enough and with the right speed and intensity where it should. This leads to forgetfulness and restlessness and the inability to concentrate. But why does this actually happen at all? How can you catch ADHD? There are hundreds of studies showing that ADHD is mostly genetic, but it can also be caused by environmental factors. When I say genetic, I mean that the errors in the dopamine expression or reception between the synapses are already fixed in the genome. There isn't a single gene that causes ADHD, nor has it been possible to find a few multiple genes that work together each time to cause ADHD. It is in the genome, but it is so highly complex that it would not make sense to look for ADHD via genetic analysis to make a diagnosis, for example. In any case, it is not something that you have learned, you have it from birth. And that also means that people who have been diagnosed with ADHD are very likely to be related to someone else who has it. The genes that have been linked to the disease are almost all involved in dopamine regulation. There are a few other transmitters affected sometimes, like the norepinephrine levels in the brain, but I'll limit myself to the common dopamine here just to explain it. There are also environmental factors that can increase the likelihood of developing ADHD, such as mother's alcohol consumption during pregnancy, exposure to certain chemical substances, and the occurrence of certain diseases during important developmental processes in the brain are taking place, such as measles, for example. These environmental influences all sound so random, as if they had nothing to do with ADHD, and they don't, but they usually influence the genome, the genetic information, and can change it at important points in the development, which means that the genome can mutate, and instead of you becoming the Witcher and killing monsters while grunting, you just become an unfocused and possibly hyperactive person who cannot make or carry out any decisions. All of this can happen to varying degrees. This disorder is a continuous spectrum, just like any disease. You are not either sick or not sick. There are many intermediate stages and symptoms of this disease, and I mean, even with a viral infection like the coronavirus at the moment, you can see that there are, on the one hand, people who have a very strong reaction to the disease, who lie in the hospital for months and may even die, others who just lose their chemical senses, taste and smell, and then others who are completely asymptomatic. This applies to almost every disease, but especially in such neurological defects, because have you seen a brain? The blob is doing everything and we know almost nothing about it. It can be that less dopamine can be formed in one very small specific place in the brain and not in the whole brain, or maybe only in regions that do not play such an important role in the daily social life. Who knows? And this is why it is so important to pay attention to the individuality of such disorders and to adapt the treatment to the individual. Yeah, the treatment. What can you do about it? Well, there are a couple of possibilities. The one that immediately comes to mind is, of course, Ritalin. Ritalin and other ADHD medication acts as stimulants on normal people. Ritalin influences both the dopamine and norepinephrine activity in your brain. It increases the actions of these neurotransmitters by blocking their reabsorption into your brain's neurons. So for normal people, they act like drugs. In my bachelor's degree, I had a few fellow students who took Ritalin under the assumption that it pushes the brain and magically makes you smarter. This is simply a misconception. Normal people taking Ritalin are just a faster and more long-lasting kind of stupid, and they can also develop addictions. If you suffer from ADHD, however, they have the opposite effect, namely that they ensure that the dopamine pathways work again and that the people can concentrate on one thing and go about their tasks without forgetting what they were actually about to do when walking into this room. An alternative treatment is, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, which aims to understand your behavior and change it in the long term and find methods through very, very hard daily training. Both methods have their advantages and disadvantages. If you can swallow a pill and immediately experience the results that you need to function normally, that's great. But what pills bring with them, besides the aforementioned possible addiction, is a dependency on the pill in order to function. After a few hours, it just doesn't work anymore, and you fall back into old patterns. Then there are the frequent difficulties of finding the correct dosage and the possible side effects. Let's do CBT then, right? Well, that's not always that much better. It is great to be independent of medication, of course, and the creativity and imagination that you have as an ADHD patient is also something really impressive and worthwhile. But you still have to function in everyday life, and behavioral therapy, it is a lifelong work, which often cannot help enough. You have to constantly try to restructure your habits in such a way that you can't forget anything important and that you can stay focused long enough to get through school class, to pursue a job, or to not forget your children in kindergarten. You have to develop individual systems that you can trust. This is very, very tough and won't do much good for many people in most situations, especially if they are being diagnosed later in life. But also in children, it is very difficult to raise the motivation because as an ADHD person, you already have a big motivational problem, as mentioned before. And as a child, you don't even see the benefit in it because you often don't understand that something is wrong. But then what is the right choice of treatment? I cannot stress this enough. This disorder is a continuous spectrum. No two ADHD or ADD patients have to 100% the same symptoms to the same extent with the same environment to which they have to react to. No two patients will respond equally well to drugs or therapies. You should definitely not put ADHD people in a drawer and throw the same therapy at them because that will cause more damage than is absolutely necessary. ADHD is a very serious brain disorder that should be treated with the individuality of the patient and his or her needs in mind. There is no one right way to treat it, and in no case should one force patients into one or the other therapy or condemn them for choosing the other. The brain is such an ingenious organ that you cannot even imagine what it is capable of, but You also cannot imagine how many different ways it can be faulty, and by faulty, of course, I mean not customized for our performance-oriented society. An individual treatment plan must be developed for each patient, flexible and perfectly tailored to the degree of his or her disorder, needs and environment, and it will usually be a combination of therapy and medication, at least for a while. So, here I am at the end, and I would like to thank you very, very much for your attention, now that we know how hard it can be. You should get your dopamine levels up to go push the like and the subscribe button, because I, Margarita, the board behavioral neuro and cognitive biologist, will post a video about the science around humans every Friday, and I would love to see you here next week as well.
You can't seriously have forgotten to wear your shoes when going out of the house again?